You ever notice how people will lose their minds over some celebrity scandal, but when your own government starts killing people in the streets, the headlines are buried, the public sleeps, and the politicians give textbook bureaucrat excuses? Let's get real. Earlier this month, on January 7th, 2026, an immigration enforcement agent shot and killed a 37-year-old woman in Minneapolis during a federal operation, a homicide, according to the local medical examiner, and the official response was more legalese than accountability. Then, just a few weeks later, on January 21st, 2026, federal agents swooped in on a 5-year-old boy and his father as they came home, handcuffed them, and hauled them off to Texas. A child ripped from his driveway like he was a criminal. And just last weekend, on January 24th, 2026, during the ongoing immigration enforcement surge in Minneapolis, federal agents shot and killed a 37-year-old ICU nurse, a US citizen, in broad daylight while he was filming the scene and trying to help someone. Ask yourself this: if ICE and Border Patrol are supposed to be protecting people, then why are US citizens dying? Why are children being detained? America is starting to sound like a sick joke. You're told to trust the system. You're told it's all legal. You're told that anything that doesn't look like order is chaos and therefore wrong. So let me ask you, what kind of world are we living in where federal agents are feared more than the criminals they're supposed to stop? Because right now, from 5-year-old kids being pulled from their homes to healthcare workers being gunned down on the street, we need to face one brutal truth. This isn't immigration enforcement. This is escalation, and it's happening in broad daylight. This video is about The Invisible Coup by Peter Schweizer. Schweizer isn't a TikTok pundit. He's an investigative journalist, a New York Times best-selling author, and a guy who has spent decades tracing money, power, and influence where polite society tells you not to look. You may know him from Clinton Cash, Red Handed, or Profiles in Corruption, books that have one thing in common: they ruin dinner conversations, because Schweizer doesn't argue vibes. He follows documents, government statements, leaked emails, court records, the boring stuff that exposes uncomfortable truths. And in The Invisible Coup, his central argument is explosive. Mass migration isn't just happening, it's being used. Not by the migrants, not by some cartoon villain cabal, but by foreign governments, ideological movements, and domestic political actors who understand something most people don't want to admit. You don't have to conquer a country with tanks if you can rewrite it demographically, culturally, and politically from the inside. This isn't a book about race. It's not about hating immigrants. And it's not a great replacement fever dream. In fact, Schweizer explicitly dismantles that narrative. This book is about subversion, the slow reversal of a system's values until it collapses under the illusion that it's being improved. And before we go any further, let's be clear. This video falls under the Fair Use Act of YouTube. It is for educational, commentary, and transformative purposes only. Nothing here is read verbatim. Nothing here replaces the book. If anything, this video exists to challenge you enough that you want to read it yourself. Because here's the uncomfortable reality: most people don't lose their freedom overnight. They lose it while arguing about labels, while trusting institutions that no longer serve them, while assuming collapse always looks dramatic. Schweizer's argument is that America isn't being overthrown, it's being reprogrammed, quietly, legally, and with your consent, or at least your apathy. And whether you agree with him or not doesn't matter. What matters is whether you're willing to actually interrogate the system you live inside, instead of defending it like it's a sports team. Welcome to Mindful Reads Hub. Let's get started. The blueprint was always there. Let's get one thing straight from the start. When a government agency starts operating as if its own rules don't apply to your home, your children, your dignity, that's not enforcement anymore. It's occupation. And the blueprint for the current escalation in US immigration enforcement wasn't drawn yesterday. It was drafted over decades, refined in crisis after crisis, and accelerated into full view by policy decisions that don't just treat migrants as problems to be managed, but as factors to be manipulated, quantified, and deployed as leverage. In the last year alone, the number of people held in Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) detention skyrocketed. Independent reports show that within a year, daily detention counts surged more than 75%, with over 68,000 people held, and more than 100 additional facilities added to the network, all while ICE's budget expanded to support this expansion. Many of those held have no criminal conviction at all, ensnared only because of immigration status and bureaucratic classification, effectively making them political pawns in a larger system. Make no mistake, these aren't abstract numbers in a spreadsheet. These are real human beings, each with a name, a backstory, and a family that now lives in the shadow of fear and uncertainty. And the composition of that detainee population? Tens of thousands without criminal history, yet treated as though they are national security threats. Meanwhile, the United Nations Human Rights Chief publicly condemned the United States, warning that rising deaths in ICE custody and the treatment of migrants reflect a systemic crisis, not isolated incidents. In official statements, the UN Rights Office made clear that practices in US immigration detention undermine due process, family unity, and basic human dignity, and that these aren't unfortunate accidents of policy, but consequences of a system stretched beyond its original mandate. But that's just the modern snapshot. To understand the blueprint, we have to trace this pattern of weaponized population movement back through history. The Invisible Coup makes the provocative argument that mass migration has long been more than a humanitarian or economic issue. It's been a tool in geopolitical strategy. Peter Schweitzer points to historical examples that prefigure today's dilemmas. Threats made at the United Nations in 1974 and 1977 by foreign leaders who viewed population movement as leverage, and the 1980 Mariel boat lift, where Fidel Castro engineered the departure of 125,000 Cubans, including criminals and individuals with mental illness, to Florida. According to Schweitzer, this wasn't random chaos, it was statecraft disguised as crisis, overwhelming local systems and sowing discord without a single shot fired. What these events share, whether historical, current, or institutional, is a pattern of external forces exploiting the very concept of migration to influence outcomes far beyond borders. And the blueprint has grown more complex. An internal ICE memo recently leaked shows agents can enter private homes without a judicial warrant, instead using administrative warrants signed by agency officials. What this means legally is enormous. The traditional Fourth Amendment safeguard that once required independent judicial oversight before entering a home is now circumvented. This marks a fundamental shift in how enforcement infrastructure interacts with everyday life, because it treats civilian homes as if they are extensions of border zones. Communities are already feeling the result. In cities like Minneapolis, reports surfaced of ICE operations sweeping entire neighborhoods, with legal residents and citizens caught in the dragnet, sparking public outrage and protests. This isn't speculation. This is happening in broad daylight as part of ongoing federal enforcement waves. Across the world, migration has never been a simple story of borders and economics. From Mediterranean refugee camps overwhelmed by conflict to asylum seekers stranded in Central America, migration now sits squarely at the intersection of policy, geopolitics, demographic engineering, and national security. And the Invisible Coup argues that this transformation did not occur by accident. It was built on decisions, incentives, and strategic choices that embedded migration deep into political leverage. This is the blueprint, an ever-expanding detention system with massive budgets and thousands of beds that hold people with no criminal histories. rights and watchdog agencies, domestic and international, issuing increasingly urgent warnings about systemic abuse and deaths in custody, shifts in enforcement practices that erode traditional civil liberties like warrantless home entries, historical precedents that show migration used not just as movement of people, but as instruments of pressure and strategic disruption. Local pushback, protests, and civil unrest directly tied to enforcement actions and policies that impact everyday citizens. Put together, this isn't chaos, it's pattern recognition, and sometimes patterns once noticed reveal intent. The unsettling truth is this: modern immigration enforcement and mass migration itself is no longer just about people crossing borders. It's about power structures wielding population flows as leverage. It's about systems that normalize intrusion into private life under the premise of security, while the public is told to accept it as inevitable or necessary. And it's about the redefinition of sovereignty without the public's consent or meaningful democratic debate. In The Invisible Coup, Schweitzer doesn't just describe border crossings. He describes the instrumentalization of people as strategic variables in national and global contests for influence. That's not policy. That's power without accountability. Key idea: modern immigration enforcement and mass migration are not disjointed responses to crises. They are part of a systemic pattern where population movements and enforcement powers are leveraged as tools of influence, demographic engineering, and statecraft. Key takeaway: when a system treats human beings as vectors for policy outcomes rather than as individuals, you're no longer witnessing governance. You're witnessing administrative warfare. What looks like enforcement or humanitarian chaos may actually be strategic design. Favorite quote: mass migration has morphed into the most powerful political weapon ever aimed at the United States, one engineered by elites at home and aided by adversaries abroad. The quiet invasion. Migration isn't a neutrally reported fact of geography. It's a political front line, and the battleground is not always at the US-Mexico line. Sometimes the real fight starts hundreds of miles south, where people pick up their children, carry their last few possessions, and walk toward nowhere with a whisper of hope, only to discover they're being used instrumentally by competing state interests, media narratives, and political pressure systems. In southern Mexico, around Tapachula in Chiapas, dozens of migrant caravans have formed not just as spontaneous movements, but as de facto protests. In early 2026, reports show a large caravan, estimated in some outlets at around 300 migrants from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, opting to head not toward the US border, but toward Mexico City, seeking legal status, jobs, and a life less precarious. Many did this because conditions at the southern border had become untenable, and because US immigration policy now filters asylum claims with digital-only appointments that are hard to secure without local tech access. That's right, migrants are choosing Mexico over the US. This isn't just anecdote. International reports and expert commentary confirm that as US policy has hardened in 2025 and 2026, more migrants are reconsidering their destination entirely, seeking refuge or work in Mexico cities instead of risking the blockades and detention regimes further north. This begs a deeper question. If the United States is portrayed as the gold standard of refuge and opportunity, why are thousands walking southward instead of north? And beneath that, who benefits from whipping global perceptions into panic cycles about invasions when the real story is far more complex? In the book, Schweitzer doesn't just chronicle policy failures or record marches. He frames organized migration and the narratives around it as instruments of geopolitical influence and internal political pressure. From Mexico's role as a buffer state to its own domestic politics under President Claudia Sheinbaum, to Washington's use of tariffs and security cooperation to compel compliance, this dynamic has become a global political chessboard. In fact, the treaty pressures are real. the US has repeatedly dangled threatened tariffs and trade restrictions over Mexico unless it agrees to intensify its own enforcement operations, a move that pushes migrants away from the US border and deeper into Mexican territory. This was especially visible after threats to impose tariffs in early 2025, followed by Mexico's deployment of thousands of National Guard troops to reinforce border security and curb drug trafficking, reinforcing migrant detention and interception operations near the Guatemala border. But here's the kicker. Sometimes those policies exactly replicate the very problems they claim to solve. Why? Because the headlines that scream "border under siege" distract from a more insidious truth. Migration isn't merely about crossing a line, it's about who controls the narrative around that crossing. In Mexico's Chiapas, migrants, many of them families and children, have walked for hundreds of miles, not just because they want a new life, but because the system left them no alternative. UNICEF reports that thousands of children are traveling with caravan groups and in need of protection, hygiene, and psychosocial support, precisely because neither Mexico nor the US has created a humane, practical mechanism for safe transit and assistance. These are facts the mainstream rarely threads together with geopolitical strategy, but when you connect the dots, a pattern emerges. US demands push Mexico to act as an enforcement proxy. Mexico then shoves migrants deeper into its own territory, where families become stuck in bureaucratic limbo. And then both governments can claim they reduced border crossings, a metric that ignores the human toll and real suffering. And let's talk pressure from Washington. We're not dealing with spontaneous policy shifts. We're watching coordinated leverage, the US threatening tariffs, Mexico responding with National Guard deployments, both governments touting security victories while deeper systemic issues go unaddressed. Neither country's political class prioritizes humane treatment of migrants over political optics and economic bargaining chips. Yet in the streets of Tapachula, and along the highways to Mexico City, the migrants themselves don't know anything about international tariffs or geopolitical strategies. They know hunger, they know fear, they know heat and exhaustion, and children crying at night. They know that every kilometer walked is another gamble against violence, extortion, and exploitation. This isn't just a story of borders. This is a story of how the powerful weaponize human movement in ways that shift narratives, change demographics, and influence political outcomes, all while the people caught in the center are treated like data points instead of humans. Key idea: migration systems and policies between the US and Mexico have evolved from simple deterrence measures into complex leverage tools that influence domestic politics, bilateral relations, and global narratives about freedom, opportunity, and national sovereignty. Key takeaway: when migration is governed by political bargaining instead of human dignity, the real crisis isn't on the border. It's in the policy rooms where decisions are made far from the suffering they create. Favorite quote: people are choosing Mexico over the US because the policies that once drew them north have turned into obstacles that leave them no clear path forward. Manufacturing power. It's one thing to talk about borders, walls, and enforcement crackdowns. It's quite another when the same institutions that claim to protect democracy quietly start building digital architectures that can track, evaluate, classify, and potentially decide who gets to vote and who doesn't, not just based on citizenship, but on a sprawling web of federal and state databases nobody really understands. Across the world, governments are wrestling with how to balance electoral integrity with individual rights. India and Brazil are moving toward biometric voter systems. Western Europe experiments with digital IDs and online participation. Some African nations are deploying mobile-based election platforms. But here in the United States, a country that once prided itself on decentralized elections, we're seeing something subtly more invasive. A federal immigration database rewired into a national citizenship and voter verification mechanism, with public benefit systems, social security files, tax records, and state voter rolls all sliding into the same digital pool. At the center of this shift is the Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements SAVE program, originally designed in the 1980s as a modest tool to verify whether someone was eligible for public benefits based on immigration status. Simple in purpose, simple in scope. But under recent policy changes, SAVE has been transformed into a sprawling data engine that can check citizenship against voter rolls, social security numbers, driver's licenses, and more, with bulk upload capabilities that turns what was once an obscure administrative process into something resembling a national identity grid. This isn't hypothetical. A Wired investigation documented a lawsuit alleging that SAVE's expansion involving the Social Security Administration and IRS data has already led to US citizens being misclassified as non-citizens and removed from voter rolls, sometimes without adequate notice or recourse. Errors in the underlying data aren't just possible, they're already documented. In Iowa, for example, a settlement gave state officials access to the SAVE database so they could verify voter citizenship. That means every name, address, and partial social security number Iowa holds could theoretically be fed into a federal system that wasn't originally built for elections, and could come back with flags that deprive someone of their fundamental civil right. Yet officials in states like Maine have openly opposed this expansion, warning that vertically integrating sensitive voter information with federal immigration systems risks privacy, overreach, and government intrusion that no democratic society should accept. Behind all this are policy choices, executive orders, and political narratives that cast the move as protecting election integrity, simultaneously creating political theater and administrative power. A March 2025 White House directive urged wider access to federal immigration data for verifying voter eligibility, comparing the US unfavorably to biometric systems abroad and urging stronger identification protocols. But here's where the pattern gets interesting and why this links back to the themes in the Invisible Coup. Data becomes leverage and leverage becomes power. The book argues that demographic and information systems are not neutral instruments. They are tools of influence and control, subject to political agendas, errors, biases, and conflicting policies. When you merge immigration data with voter registration, and when errors in one system can cancel someone's voting rights in another, you aren't simply guarding elections. You're creating a system that determines belonging and exclusion in ways no politician has clearly explained to the public. And let's remember, this isn't just about disenfranchising a tiny hypothetical group of non-citizens. Wired's reporting highlights citizens already wrongly purged due to outdated or mismatched records. That's not a statistic, that's people. Parents, workers, students suddenly told they no longer have a voice because an algorithm flagged them incorrectly. Couple this with aggressive settlement agreements that expand SAVE's use across 26 states, bulk uploads of millions of records, and legal complaints arguing the database violates privacy laws and lacks congressional authorization. And you start to see the contours of a data-driven influence machine far beyond what anyone signed up for. And here's the kicker. While some states and federal officials defend the expansion as necessary to prevent non-existent, non-citizen voting, research shows actual cases of foreign nationals voting are vanishingly rare. The systems being built don't just catch fraud, they catch legitimate citizens because of flawed data, incomplete records, and overlapping bureaucratic processes that were never meant to serve this purpose. This is the new battleground. It's quiet, it's technical, it doesn't get rallies or cable news segments, but it has real stakes. Your right to vote, your identity in government systems, and the merging of immigration enforcement tools with election infrastructure. That's not a policy evolution. That's the manufacturing of power through information control, and it's happening under the public's radar. Key idea: the expansion of federal immigration databases into voter verification and citizenship screening systems illustrates how information systems can transform from administrative tools into mechanisms of power and control with serious implications for individual rights. Key takeaway: when bureaucratic systems designed for immigration enforcement start determining eligibility to vote, democracy itself can erode from the inside, not with a bang, but with lines of code and unchecked data integration. Favorite quote: as states check voter registration against a mashup of federal data, new complaints say US citizens are being kicked off state voter rolls as a result. The imported revolution. Some battles aren't fought with soldiers or tanks, they're fought in lecture halls, labs, and student dorms. And right now, the war over influence, ideology, and control isn't happening just at the physical border. It's happening in the minds of young people, in universities around the world, and in policy rooms where national reputation is traded for strategic positioning. For decades, the United States welcomed international students as a soft power advantage. Governments from Beijing to Brasilia sent aspiring engineers and economists northward, not just for degrees, but for ideas, networks, and connections, the kind that ripple through decades and shape geopolitics. But over the last few years, this long-standing system has been weaponized into a tool of suspicion, geopolitical brinkmanship, and demographic leverage. From the late 1970s through the early 2000s, China sent hundreds of thousands of students to American universities, part of a two-way exchange that, at its best, forged understanding across societies. US institutions became magnets for global talent, especially in STEM fields that powered Silicon Valley, biotech, and advanced research. But as US-China tensions hardened, that narrative shifted from exchange to infiltration, with politicians framing international students, especially Chinese nationals, as potential threats or proxies for foreign influence. Fast forward to May 28, 2025, when US Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced a policy to aggressively revoke visas of Chinese students who have alleged ties to the Chinese Communist Party or are studying in what Washington labels critical fields. This wasn't a localized, narrow policy. It was pitched as a broad strategy tied to national security and academic sovereignty. The new measures came without clear criteria, a fog that leaves students, universities, and entire research ecosystems guessing. How do you define a critical field? What counts as a tie to a political party? And once a visa is revoked, what recourse does the student have? Critics have pointed out that ambiguous language and broad authority pave the way for arbitrary decisions that can disrupt futures and undermine academic freedom. The global reaction has been swift. In Beijing, China's foreign ministry publicly blasted the policy as discriminatory and damaging to US-China educational cooperation, warning that political interference undercuts decades of cultural exchange and mutual growth. Chinese analysts describe the move as part of a broader strategy to erect a visa wall between the two superpowers, one that doesn't just block borders but chills human interaction. And that chilling effect is real. A recent industry analysis found that nearly 90% of international students have modified their online presence to avoid scrutiny, reporting reduced political engagement and anxiety about social media behavior being fed into surveillance systems tied to visa decisions. Universities themselves, institutions historically at the forefront of global mobility, have pushed back. A coalition, including over 60 higher education and civil rights organizations, wrote directly to the US State Department, warning that visa revocation policies hurt not only student safety and well-being, but also America's values and international reputation. Many argue these policies jeopardize US academic leadership by discouraging the world's top talent from studying in America, a loss that could echo through years of scientific and technological competition. Meanwhile, institutions like Harvard are seeing contradictory trends. Even as policy becomes restrictive, Chinese student enrollment at some elite schools rose in 2025, signaling that demand for American education remains strong despite policy pressure. This clash isn't happening in a vacuum. Around the world, other countries are recognizing the value of global academic mobility. A recent international study found that visa-free policies, such as those implemented by China since 2023, significantly increased cross-border research cooperation and scientific output, especially in regions with fewer institutional barriers. The contrast is stark. While some nations lower barriers and reap collaboration dividends, the US increasingly raises them, ostensibly in the name of security, but often at the cost of its own soft power and academic prestige. This showdown over student visas and academic exchange reflects a deeper truth. Migration isn't just about bodies moving across borders. It's about ideas moving across minds and influence moving across institutions. The edges of this struggle, the foreign students, the disrupted visa appointments, the anxiety-ridden campuses, are where global power is actually being rewired. And while some policymakers frame these measures as defending national interest, critics warn this strategy could become a self-inflicted wound, hollowing out US competitiveness, eroding trust, and turning the promise of global education into another arena of geopolitical hostility. Key idea: the recent crackdown and politicization of international, particularly Chinese, student visas reflects a shift from academic exchange toward the use of education policy as a tool of geopolitical strategy and influence control. Key takeaway: when global mobility and academic collaboration are treated as arenas of suspicion rather than bridges of cooperation, the result is not security. It's self-sabotage that weakens innovation, soft power, and international trust. Favorite quote: educational exchange built bridges between societies. Turning it into a battleground erodes the very foundations of cooperation that once defined global progress. Strange allies, shared goals. You ever watch two governments pretend they're at war, but somehow you still end up in the crossfire? Because that's exactly what's unfolding at the edges of the Americas right now, and the people caught in the middle aren't soldiers, they're civilians, families, communities, even entire nations watching the strings being pulled by forces larger than them. Across the US-Mexico border and beyond, what started as a drug war has morphed into something far more tangled. A geopolitical pressure cooker where policy, economics, military might, and international diplomacy are colliding, and ordinary people are paying the price as politicians claim national security while escalating every tool in the arsenal. We're talking about a border region that has become a counterterrorism stage, complete with military jargon, troop deployments, extraditions, tariff threats, and even talk of ground strikes. Just last week, US President Donald Trump said American forces will start now hitting land in Mexico against cartels, a statement that, if enacted, would violate international law and effectively be an invasion of a sovereign nation. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum rejected such a move outright, framing it as a violation of sovereignty and insisting the Americas aren't anyone's backyard to invade. The confrontation isn't just talk. In the last year, Mexico has extradited 37 cartel figures, including alleged members of the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels, to the US to face charges including narcotics trafficking and terrorism-linked offenses. That marked the third such transfer in a year, a show of cooperation aimed at easing US pressure even as legal and diplomatic lines are being pushed. This has become a strange duet. The US says it needs action to stop drug and migrant flows. Mexico says it's acting on its own terms and are protecting sovereignty, and the truth on the ground is far messier. Tariffs have been slapped on Canada and Mexico under the pretext of curbing drug trafficking, even though nearly all fentanyl entering the US still comes through Mexico, not Canada. A statistical reality that opponents say embarrasses the political narrative being used to justify heavy-handed measures. The US has even declared cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, effectively recasting a law enforcement issue into a national security theater with almost unlimited authority, opening the door to military involvement, intelligence action, and counterterrorism, framing previously reserved for extremist groups. This isn't just about drugs, it's about political leverage, economic warfare, and narrative control. By treating cartels as terrorists and linking drug flows to immigration policy, and then tying both to trade measures like steep tariffs, Washington is effectively restructuring how international pressure is applied across borders. Tariffs on Canada were justified on the basis of alleged fentanyl flow, despite public data showing Canada accounts for an infinitesimal share of cross-border seizures. On the ground in Mexico, authorities are walking a tightrope between cooperation and resistance. President Sheinbaum insists that no US troops will enter Mexican soil, upholding sovereignty while still engaging in anti-cartel cooperation that includes record fentanyl seizures and joint operations with US law enforcement. This has real human consequences, from towns near Nogales and El Paso seeing increased militarization and drone patrols to Caribbean naval deployments targeting cartel routes outside national borders. It's people's lives, their communities, their children's futures being thrown into this broader power game. And yet, the narrative being sold to the public that stronger borders, heavier tariffs, and militarized engagement will solve the root problems doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Experts argue that the demand for drugs in one country fuels supply in another, that cartel networks adapt like hydras, and that simply raising barriers without addressing economic, social, and public health drivers only shifts the problem rather than solving it. What's more, the conflict has become a negotiating tool. Mexico's decision to extradite high-value cartel figures isn't just law enforcement, it's political signaling to both domestic constituencies and Washington. The US response, tariffs, threats, military framing, isn't just security policy, it's leverage in trade, migration, and diplomatic arenas. Underneath all this, average families, US, Mexican, and Canadian alike, are left paying higher prices, heightened fear, and deeper mistrust of institutions that claim to be protecting them. From border checkpoints to international press conferences, from tariff lists to extradition flights, the standoff over drugs and the ways it's entangled with migration, national rhetoric, and economic pressure has become a metaphor for how modern power plays out. Not with a single decisive battle, but with 1,000 interlocking policies that reshape societies without the public even realizing how deeply they've been rearranged. Key idea: the intersection of cartel conflict, migration policy, and international economic pressure has transformed border enforcement into a multifaceted geopolitical struggle, where strategies originally aimed at public safety have become tools of power projection and diplomatic leverage. Key takeaway: when law enforcement, national security rhetoric, and international trade policy converge, the result isn't just crime fighting, it's a reconfiguration of global influence that affects everyday life far beyond the borders themselves. Favorite quote: "We are going to start now, hitting land." A phrase that turned a drug enforcement narrative into something closer to military invasion rhetoric, and a stark example of how policy language can reshape entire geopolitical landscapes. The counteroffensive. At some point, the rhetoric of law and order stops being an abstract slogan and starts showing up as visible cruelty on the faces of people who thought they were safe under the rule of law. What we're witnessing now across the US, from Chicago to California to Minnesota, looks less like enforcement and more like a structural fight over who counts as a human being with rights and who doesn't. And those resisting are not fringe voices. They're judges, lawyers, activists, municipalities, and everyday citizens who are stepping into legal battlefields most Americans have been too comfortable to explore until now. Take the uproar in suburban Chicago's Broadview ICE processing facility, a place that was supposed to be a temporary holding spot, not a detention labyrinth where people languish for days or weeks without basics like a bed, soap, water, proper food, or access to counsel. Lawyers, civil rights groups, and detainees describe a facility where individuals, men, women, asylum seekers, people with medical needs, are crammed into tiny rooms, forced to sleep on hard concrete floors or plastic chairs, and held without meaningful contact with the outside world. The lawsuit, filed as a class action by the American Civil Liberties Union and the MacArthur Justice Center, paints a picture that would make a humanitarian aid worker in a war zone flinch. People denied legal counsel, coerced into signing away rights they didn't understand, denied food, water, and medical care, even denied the ability to shower or communicate in their own language. Advocates argue that this has become a black box, a place where immigrants are effectively disappeared from the justice system, left to face arbitrary administrative power instead of due process. And it's not just one facility. Similar lawsuits have emerged alleging inhumane conditions at other ICE centers, including a California detention facility where detainees claim severe medical neglect, hunger, freezing conditions, and rampant abuse, the kind of conditions that prompt observers to ask whether prison might be more humane. These legal challenges don't exist in isolation. They are part of a broader backlash, institutional counteroffensives against what critics call a systemic abuse of power by immigration enforcement. They echo global resistance movements where citizens push back against state overreach, from European human rights protests against offshore detention camps to Latin American indigenous groups rejecting militarized immigration sweeps, to African civil liberties coalitions opposing arbitrary detentions of migrants and asylum seekers. Worldwide, people are beginning to question whether the systems designed to manage migration have become mechanisms of coercion and punishment. In Chicago, a federal judge didn't just let these accusations sit in the dark. A magistrate compelled the Department of Homeland Security to hand over video footage and arrest data relating to conditions inside Broadview, pushing back on government resistance to transparency. That's not a passive court. That's a judiciary stepping in to enforce accountability. Other courts have taken similar stands. In Minnesota, a federal judge ruled that ICE agents violated the Constitution by entering a resident's home without a judicial warrant, contradicting internal ICE directives that suggested administrative warrants were sufficient for home entry. A ruling like that isn't just a courtroom technicality, it's a declaration that certain enforcement practices run head-on into bedrock civil liberties. Across the US, the Department of Justice and city governments are even probing whether local officials obstructed ICE during large raids, reflecting political tussles over who should hold the reins of power and accountability in communities. And in Minnesota's Twin Cities, outrage has exploded after federal immigration agents shot and killed civilians, not in some foreign conflict zone, but on American streets, fueling protests, lawsuits, and a broader national debate about the role of federal enforcement in domestic life. These legal struggles and public pushbacks reveal a deeper truth about the modern immigration system. It's no longer a matter of paperwork and border checkpoints. It's become a battle over civil liberties, constitutional constraints, and the very idea of human dignity under state power. Across the world, courts are being asked to enforce limits on executive authority, from European human rights tribunals ruling against deportations without due process, to Canadian courts scrutinizing detention conditions, to Philippine and Australian legal challenges against offshore processing centers that hold refugees in limbo. In the US, this institutional pushback is happening in real time, challenging the narrative that enforcement powers should expand without oversight. Lawyers representing detainees have forced judges to inspect facilities, something that echoes global human rights observers calling for access to detention centers from the Red Cross to the UN Human Rights Council, because transparency is the first step in accountability. People held in these facilities aren't abstractions. Their grandparents struggling with diabetes denied proper meals, asylum seekers unable to see lawyers, families separated by opaque enforcement decisions, and individuals whose basic constitutional rights are being tested in the courts. The legal battles emerging from these sites are not just about immigration law. They're about whether societies will allow powers of enforcement to operate above accountability without checks and balances. And while some officials defend enforcement as necessary for national security, the resistance from civil rights groups, judges, activists, and everyday citizens underscores a fundamental question that resonates worldwide. When does the enforcement of law become the violation of rights? When does protecting a border become a justification for infringing on the humanity of the very people the system claims to serve? Key idea: the rising wave of lawsuits, judicial rulings, and public pushback against inhumane conditions and constitutional violations in immigration detention centers represents a global struggle for rights, accountability, and limits on government power, reframing immigration enforcement from a legality debate into a civil liberties battleground. Key takeaway: when enforcement disregards dignity, due process, and transparency, resistance emerges not only from activists, but from judges and institutional mechanisms designed to check power. And that resistance defines whether civil liberties will endure. Favorite quote: everyone, no matter their legal status, has the right to access counsel and to not be subject to horrific and inhumane conditions. Conclusion: let's be honest with ourselves for a second. When you strip away the noise, the pundits, the talking heads, and the polished press releases, there's a pattern here. From detention camps ballooning like industrial zones to endless legal and civil battles, from governments shaping migration flows to databases quietly deciding who counts as a citizen and who doesn't, all the way to the geopolitical games played with student visas and drug war posturing. What we're witnessing is not a series of random policies. We're watching the architecture of power redefine reality itself. And you've seen it, not just through the lens of one country, but across the globe, when the headlines from Washington, Mexico City, Beijing, and beyond start to read the same way: crisis, containment, extraction, control. That's when you need to stop scrolling and start connecting the dots. Let's pull the strings together. There was a blueprint that didn't just evolve, it was engineered, a plan that took migration, enforcement, demographics, and data and fused them into a single dynamic force. A force that turns people into numbers, rights into loopholes, and policy into weaponized infrastructure. From ICE detention spikes to UN condemnation, from migrant caravans in Chiapas to tariff pressure strategies, from federal databases that vet citizens to academic exchange turned national security flashpoints, all roads lead back to one thing: who decides the value of a human life and on what authority? You see, this story isn't ultimately about borders, spreadsheets, or statutes. It's about us. All of us. It's about the insistence of some that walls and enforcement are the answer, and the refusal of others to accept that human worth should be measured by paperwork or place of birth. Everyone has a right to live, no matter where they come from, no matter the color of their skin, no matter the direction of their journey. God didn't give us borders, we as humans created them. Lines in the sand that we tell ourselves keep us safe, when more often they divide us from empathy, from truth, and ultimately from each other. If you walk away with one understanding from all this, let it be this: real power isn't about who controls borders. Real power is about who controls the narrative. And the story we've been told about migration, security, and sovereignty has been shaped by people who benefit when the public stays confused, divided, and too afraid to ask the hard questions. So don't let them win that battle. Stand up, read, debate, dissect. Question institutional narratives not because they are convenient, but because they shape everything you and future generations will live under. And if you want to dive deeper into the evidence, the patterns, the documents, and the real analysis behind all of this, you owe it to yourself to buy the book. Read it with a critical mind, not as gospel, but as a roadmap, one that shows how power operates when it's hidden in plain sight. Change doesn't happen through silence. Change doesn't happen through passive acceptance. Change happens when people wake up, open their eyes, and refuse to let narratives be written for them. This isn't the end of the conversation. It's the moment you decide whether you will be informed spectators or engaged participants in the story of your world. And here's the real truth that no politician, bureaucrat, or think tank pundit will ever tell you. You are not defined by the borders drawn on maps. You are defined by the questions you refuse to stop asking. Stay curious, stay defiant, and above all, stay human.